In September 2019, two children suddenly disappeared in the quiet town of Rexburg, Idaho. At first, very few people knew their names. But within months, their story would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern American history. The children were 17-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua, J.J., Vallow. To the outside world, they appeared to be part of a normal American family. Their mother, Lori Vallow, had recently moved them to Idaho from Arizona. Friends described Lori as a devoted mother, someone who appeared cheerful, energetic, and deeply religious. But behind that image, investigators would soon uncover a web of strange beliefs, suspicious deaths, and shocking secrets. And at the center of it all was Lori Vallow herself. For years before the children disappeared, Lori's life had already been filled with chaos. She had been married multiple times and had experienced several dramatic family conflicts. Her daughter, Tylee Ryan, was from a previous marriage to a man named Joseph Ryan. Her younger son, J.J. Vallow, had been adopted by Lori and her then-husband Charles Vallow. J.J. had autism and required special care, something Lori had once appeared dedicated to providing. For a time, the family lived a relatively quiet life in Arizona. But everything began to change in 2018. That was when Lori became deeply involved in a small religious group focused on apocalyptic beliefs. The group was centered around the idea that the world was approaching its final days. Members believed they had been chosen by God to prepare for the coming end of the world. One of the most influential figures in this movement was a man named Chad Daybell. Daybell was a self-published author who wrote books about near-death experiences and religious prophecies. His writings described visions of the future, including catastrophic events that he believed would soon take place. When Lori Vallow encountered Chad Daybell's teachings, something inside her seemed to change. Friends later reported that Lori began speaking about spiritual visions and divine missions. According to people who knew her, she became convinced that she had a special role to play in the approaching end times. Soon, Lori and Chad began communicating regularly. Their conversations reportedly revolved around spiritual revelations and supernatural beliefs. But those beliefs soon took a darker turn. According to investigators, Chad and Lori began describing certain people as dark spirits or zombies. In their belief system, a person could become possessed by an evil spirit. Once someone was labeled as dark, they were considered spiritually lost. And according to witnesses, Chad and Lori believed that such individuals could no longer be saved. These strange beliefs would later become a crucial part of the investigation. But in early 2019, few people knew how extreme those ideas had become. Meanwhile, Lori's family life was beginning to unravel. Her husband Charles Vallow had grown increasingly worried about her behavior. Friends later said Charles believed Lori had become obsessed with apocalyptic ideas. At one point, Charles reportedly told relatives that Lori believed she had been chosen as a divine figure sent to prepare for the end of the world. He also claimed that Lori believed he had been possessed by a dark spirit. In January 2019, Charles even contacted police in Arizona, asking for help because he feared Lori was having a psychological crisis. But despite his concerns, the situation did not lead to any major intervention. Months later, events would take a shocking turn. In July 2019, Charles Vallow was shot and killed. The person who fired the gun was Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Alex told police that he had acted in self-defense during a family argument. According to his story, Charles had become aggressive and threatened him with a baseball bat. Police initially treated the shooting as a possible case of self-defense. No immediate charges were filed. But the death of Charles Vallow would later become one of the most suspicious events connected to the case. Just weeks after Charles died, Lori made a sudden decision. She moved her children, Tylee and J.J., to Rexburg, Idaho. The move surprised many people who knew the family. Rexburg was a quiet college town, home to Brigham Young University, Idaho. It was also the town where Chad Daybell lived with his wife and children. When Lori arrived in Idaho, neighbors described her as friendly and energetic. She introduced herself as a mother who had recently moved to the area. At first, nothing about her behavior appeared unusual. Tylee and JJ were seen around the apartment complex during the first weeks after their arrival. But by September 2019, everything changed. That month, Tylee Ryan was last seen alive. Only weeks later, JJ Vallow also disappeared. At the time, almost no one outside the family noticed anything unusual. Lori continued living in Rexburg. She spent time with Chad Daybell. And when people asked about the children, she gave different explanations. Sometimes she claimed that JJ was staying with relatives. Other times she said the children were with friends. But as weeks passed, those explanations began to raise serious concerns. Family members in Arizona grew worried. JJ's grandparents had not spoken with him in weeks. His school reported that he had suddenly stopped attending classes. And when relatives asked Lori where the children were, her answers became increasingly vague. Eventually, authorities were contacted. By late November 2019, police in Rexburg launched a welfare check for JJ Vallow. Officers went to Lori's apartment and asked to see the boy. But Lori told them that JJ was staying with a friend in Arizona. When investigators attempted to verify that claim, they quickly discovered something troubling. The story was not true. JJ was not with the person Lori had mentioned. In fact, no one seemed to know where he was. Suddenly, the disappearance of 2 children became a national concern. Police returned to Lori's apartment to question her again. But when they arrived, Lori was gone. She had abruptly left Idaho. And Chad Daybell had left with her. Within days, investigators realized that the case had become far more serious than a simple welfare check. 2 children had vanished. Their mother had fled the state. And the people closest to them were giving conflicting stories about where they might be. Soon, the search for Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow would expand across several states. As investigators dug deeper into Lori Vallow's past, they began uncovering a pattern of strange events. Suspicious deaths. Unusual beliefs. And a growing number of people who had suddenly disappeared from Lori's life. But the most disturbing discovery was still ahead. Because the search for the missing children would eventually lead investigators to a place no one expected. A quiet property in Idaho. Owned by Chad Daybell. And what investigators would find there would shock the entire country. After Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell suddenly left Idaho, the disappearance of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow quickly became a national story. What had started as a simple welfare check had now turned into a multi-state investigation involving several police departments. Authorities across the United States began searching for the missing children. Meanwhile, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had traveled to Hawaii. Investigators soon discovered that the couple had arrived on the island of Kauai, thousands of miles away from Idaho. Even more surprising was what they did next. On November 5, 2019, Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy Daybell, had died suddenly in Idaho. At the time, her death had been described as natural. But only weeks later, Chad was now in Hawaii with Lori. And just 17 days after Tammy's death, Lori and Chad got married on a beach in Hawaii. The images shocked the public when they later appeared in the news. While police across the country were searching desperately for 2 missing children, their mother was smiling in wedding photos on a tropical island. Investigators quickly began asking new questions. Where were Tylee and JJ? Why had Lori and Chad left Idaho so suddenly? And how had Chad's wife died only weeks before he married Lori? Back in Idaho, detectives continued gathering evidence. They searched Lori's apartment in Rexburg and spoke with neighbors who had lived nearby. Several residents told investigators that they had seen the children during the first weeks after Lori moved in. But after September 2019, no one remembered seeing them again. One neighbor recalled the last time JJ had been seen playing outside. Another said Tylee had helped Lori carry groceries into the apartment. After that, the children seemed to vanish. Investigators also examined phone records connected to the family. Cell phone data soon revealed something very important. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, had visited the Rexburg property several times during the days when the children were last known to be alive. Alex Cox was already known to investigators. He was the man who had shot and killed Charles Vallow earlier that year. Although that shooting had initially been ruled self-defense, detectives were beginning to look at Alex's actions more closely. According to cell phone records, Alex had been near Lori's apartment the night JJ was last seen. His phone had also been near Chad Daybell's rural property shortly afterward. This discovery immediately raised serious concerns. Meanwhile, authorities in Idaho obtained a court order demanding that Lori Vallow produce the children. The order required her to bring Tylee and JJ to authorities within 5 days. If she failed to do so, she could face criminal charges. But Lori ignored the order. Instead of cooperating, she continued living in Hawaii with Chad Daybell. Police officers on the island eventually located the couple and attempted to question them. But Lori refused to explain where the children were. Her silence only deepened the mystery. Back in Idaho, investigators began examining Chad Daybell's property more closely. Chad lived on a quiet piece of land outside the town of Rexburg. The property included a house, several outbuildings, and a large open yard. At first, nothing unusual had been noticed there. But the new cell phone data suggested that Alex Cox had visited the property during the time the children disappeared. For detectives, this was a critical clue. If Alex had gone to Chad's property shortly after the children vanished, it raised the possibility that evidence might be hidden there. But before investigators could fully explore that possibility, another shocking event occurred. In December 2019, Lori's brother Alex Cox suddenly died. He collapsed at a home in Arizona and was later pronounced dead. At first, his death was believed to be from natural causes. But investigators immediately recognized the significance of the timing. Alex Cox had been connected to several key events in the case. He had shot Charles Vallow. His phone had been near Lori's apartment when the children were last seen. And his phone data placed him at Chad Daybell's property shortly afterward. Now, the man who might have answered many questions was gone. Despite this setback, the investigation continued. By early 2020, the search for Tylee and JJ had become an international news story. Television networks across the United States began reporting on the strange case. The public watched as police described Lori and Chad's unusual beliefs. Investigators revealed that the couple believed certain people were possessed by evil spirits. According to witnesses, Chad had created a scale ranking people as either light or dark. Those considered dark were believed to be controlled by evil forces. Several people connected to Lori had reportedly been labeled this way. Some investigators feared that these beliefs might have played a role in the disappearance of the children. As pressure from the public continued to grow, authorities took action. In February 2020, Lori Vallow was arrested in Hawaii. She was charged with child abandonment and failing to comply with the court order to produce her children. Police took her into custody while she was staying in a condominium complex on the island of Kauai. Video footage showed Lori smiling as officers escorted her away. The images sparked outrage across the country. Many people could not understand how a mother could appear so calm while her children were missing. Soon after her arrest, Lori was extradited back to Idaho. She was placed in jail while investigators continued searching for answers. But the most important question still remained. Where were Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow? For months, detectives continued reviewing evidence connected to Chad Daybell's property. They examined satellite images. They analyzed cell phone location data. They interviewed witnesses who had visited the land. Then, in June 2020, investigators made a decision that would change the entire case. Police officers and FBI agents arrived at Chad Daybell's property with a search warrant. For hours, they searched the land. Neighbors watched as investigators dug into the ground. The quiet rural property had suddenly become the center of a massive crime scene investigation. And what investigators would soon discover beneath the soil would shock the entire world. Because buried in the yard of Chad Daybell's property were remains. Remains that investigators feared belonged to the two missing children. The search that had begun months earlier was about to reveal a horrifying truth. And the discovery would finally bring answers to the mystery that had haunted the nation. In June 2020, the investigation into the disappearance of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow reached a turning point that shocked the entire country. For months, authorities had been searching for the two missing children. Police had examined phone records, questioned family members, and tracked the movements of several people connected to the case. But until that moment, investigators still did not know where the children were. That changed when law enforcement officers arrived at Chad Daybell's rural property near Rexburg, Idaho. Early in the morning, police vehicles surrounded the quiet neighborhood. Investigators, forensic specialists, and FBI agents entered the property with a search warrant. Neighbors watched as officers began searching the yard. At first, it was not clear what they were looking for. But within a few hours, the situation became unmistakably serious. Investigators began digging in several areas of the property. The search continued throughout the morning. Then, sometime in the afternoon, officers made a discovery. Buried in the ground behind the house, investigators found human remains. Shortly afterward, another set of remains was discovered in a different area of the property. The search immediately turned into a major crime scene investigation. For months, the entire country had been asking one question. Where were Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow? Now investigators feared they had found the answer. Later that day, authorities confirmed the remains had been recovered from Chad Daybell's property. Although forensic testing was still required, investigators believed the remains likely belonged to the two missing children. The news spread rapidly across the United States. For many people who had followed the case, the discovery confirmed the worst possible outcome. The search for two missing children had ended in tragedy. While investigators continued working at the property, another dramatic event occurred. Chad Daybell attempted to leave the scene in his vehicle. Police officers quickly stopped him and placed him under arrest. He was taken into custody and charged with evidence tampering and destruction of evidence. The discovery of the remains had changed everything. What had once been a missing persons investigation was now clearly a murder case. Soon after the arrest, forensic scientists began analyzing the remains. The results confirmed investigators' fears. The remains found on the property belonged to Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. The details of how the children had been buried were deeply disturbing. Investigators reported that J.J.'s body had been wrapped in plastic and secured with tape. Tylee's remains had been badly damaged, making identification much more difficult. For detectives, the evidence strongly suggested that someone had deliberately attempted to conceal the bodies. But the discovery also raised new questions. Who had killed the children? And who had buried them on Chad Daybell's property? Prosecutors soon began building a case against both Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. They believed the two had worked together in a plan that led to the deaths of the children. According to investigators, the strange religious beliefs shared by Lori and Chad may have played a major role in the crimes. Witnesses later testified that Chad had described certain people as dark spirits or zombies. In this belief system, a person labeled as dark was believed to be possessed by evil. According to testimony, Chad and Lori believed that once someone became a zombie, their physical body was no longer the real person. Some investigators believe this belief may have been used to justify the killings. Prosecutors also revealed additional evidence linking Lori's brother, Alex Cox, to the timeline of the crimes. Cell phone records showed that Alex had visited Chad's property during the same period when the children disappeared. His phone location data placed him near the areas where the remains were later discovered. But Alex Cox was no longer alive to answer questions. He had died months earlier under mysterious circumstances. Despite this, investigators believed they had enough evidence to move forward with charges. In May 2021, both Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell were formally charged with the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. They were also charged with conspiracy to commit murder. In addition, prosecutors charged them with crimes connected to the death of Tylee Daybell, Chad's first wife. Authorities now believe Tammy's death had not been natural. Her body was exhumed and re-examined by forensic experts. Investigators began building the theory that multiple deaths connected to Lori and Chad might have been part of a larger plan. For the families of the victims, the discovery of the children's remains was devastating. JJ's grandparents had spent months hoping he would be found alive. Tylee's relatives had also searched desperately for answers. Now those hopes were gone. The case had become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in recent American history. It involved missing children, suspicious deaths, strange religious beliefs, and a complex web of relationships. But the legal battle was only beginning. Both Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell pleaded not guilty to the charges. They would each face separate trials in the years ahead. Prosecutors believed the evidence would prove that the two had worked together in a deadly plan motivated by power, money, and extreme religious beliefs. But the defense teams argued that the case was far more complicated. They questioned the reliability of certain witnesses and challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. The courtroom battles would take years to unfold. But one thing was already certain. The quiet property in Rexburg, Idaho had revealed the tragic ending to a mystery that had once captivated the entire nation. 2 children had disappeared. Their bodies had been hidden in the backyard of a man who claimed to receive divine visions. And the truth behind those crimes would soon be examined in a courtroom where the world would be watching closely. After the remains of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were discovered on Chad Daybell's property in June 2020, the investigation quickly moved into its next phase. What had once been a missing persons case was now one of the most disturbing murder prosecutions in the United States. Prosecutors began building a detailed case against Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Investigators believed the two had formed a dangerous partnership fueled by extreme religious beliefs, financial motives, and personal relationships that had spiraled out of control. But proving those claims in court would take time. For nearly 2 years, both Lori and Chad remained in custody while attorneys prepared for trial. During that time, investigators continued examining the evidence connected to the deaths of the children. They also expanded their investigation into the death of Chad Daybell's first wife, Tylee Daybell. When Tammy died suddenly in October 2019, her death had initially been reported as natural. But after the disappearance of the children and the growing investigation around Lori and Chad, authorities began questioning that conclusion. Tammy's body was exhumed and examined again by forensic experts. The new autopsy results suggested that her death may not have been natural after all. Prosecutors eventually charged Chad Daybell with Tylee Daybell's murder. For investigators, this discovery supported a disturbing theory. They believed several deaths connected to Lori and Chad may have been part of a larger plan. According to prosecutors, money may have played a role in the crimes. After Tammy's death, Chad had received life insurance benefits. And shortly before Charles Vallow died in 2019, he had reportedly changed the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, removing Lori from the policy. Investigators believe that decision may have caused tension between the couple. But prosecutors also focused heavily on the unusual religious beliefs shared by Lori and Chad. Witnesses who had once been close to the couple later testified about the strange ideas they discussed. According to those witnesses, Chad had created a spiritual ranking system that labeled people as either light or dark. People labeled as dark were believed to be possessed by evil spirits. Within this belief system, a person's body could supposedly be taken over by a zombie. According to testimony presented in court, Chad and Lori sometimes described certain people in their lives as zombies. Prosecutors argued that these beliefs were used to justify violence against those individuals. In their theory, the children had been labeled as dark by Chad and Lori. The same label had reportedly been used to describe Charles Vallow and Tylee Daybell before their deaths. When the trial of Lori Vallow finally began in 2023, the courtroom quickly filled with reporters, investigators, and family members of the victims. The case had captured national attention for years. Now, the public would finally hear the full story. During the trial, prosecutors presented months of evidence. They showed phone records that tracked the movements of Lori, Chad, and Alex Cox during the days surrounding the children's deaths. They presented text messages between Lori and Chad that revealed the nature of their relationship. Those messages often contained references to their unusual spiritual beliefs. Witnesses also testified about Lori's behavior during the time when the children were missing. Several people described how Lori appeared unusually calm, even cheerful, while others were desperately searching for the children. Prosecutors also described the evidence discovered at Chad Daybell's property. They explained how the children's remains had been buried in separate areas of the yard. Investigators told the jury that the burial sites had been located using cell phone location data connected to Alex Cox. That data showed Alex had been on the property at the same times the children were believed to have died. Although Alex Cox had died before charges could be brought against him, prosecutors argued that he had played a key role in the crimes. Throughout the trial, Lori Vallow maintained her innocence. Her defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on interpretation rather than direct evidence. They pointed out that Lori had not physically been present at the burial site when the remains were discovered. They also argued that the religious beliefs discussed in the trial had been misunderstood or exaggerated. But the prosecution presented a different picture. They argued that Lori had been fully aware of the plan that led to the deaths of her children. They described her as an active participant in the conspiracy. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. The jury began deliberating. For the families of the victims, the wait was agonizing. Finally, the verdict was announced. In May 2023, Lori Vallow was found guilty of multiple charges, including the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. She was also convicted in connection with the conspiracy to murder Chad Daybell. Soon afterward, the judge sentenced Lori Vallow to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never erase the loss of 2 young lives. But the story did not end there. Chad Daybell still faced his own trial for the same crimes. Prosecutors continued preparing their case against him, arguing that he had been the central figure behind the extreme beliefs that influenced the events. The case would continue to unfold in court, as investigators and prosecutors worked to fully reveal what had happened. What began as the disappearance of 2 children had exposed a shocking story of manipulation, fanatic beliefs, and betrayal. The quiet town of Rexburg, Idaho had become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent history. And the tragic deaths of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow would remain a reminder of how dangerous extreme beliefs and unchecked influence can become when they are allowed to grow in secrecy.